Hey there, this is Alexis Knight. Welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. I am your host, guiding you through cases that have moved through the courts and reached a conclusion, but have left the public divided. These are not your typical cut and dried cases. These are the ones where the facts may be clear, but the truth, well, that can be another story. Now imagine this. You are a teenager navigating the challenges of high school, making friends, and trying to find your place in the world. You finally find a group that accepts you, that makes you feel like you belong. But then the unthinkable happens. A bond of friendship is shattered by violence, and lives are destroyed. What could drive someone to commit such a horrific act against those they call friends? Was it manipulation, fear, or something darker? Here we are going to dive into the case of Christine Paolilla, a shy and seemingly innocent high school student who became involved in one of Texas's most shocking crimes, the Clear Lake murders. In 2003, Christine and her boyfriend, Christopher Snyder, killed 4 of her friends in a brutal attack that left an entire community reeling. Paolilla's story is one of contradictions. She was crowned Miss Irresistible by her classmates, celebrated for her charm and resilience despite personal struggles. But beneath the surface, a darker narrative was unfolding, one of toxic relationships, peer influence, and unimaginable betrayal. As we dive into this case, we are going to examine the facts, explore the motivations behind the crime, and question the line between influence and intent. Was Christine a victim of manipulation, or did she act out of her own free will? By the end of this episode, you will have the chance to decide for yourself. Was justice truly served, or is there more to the story? Christine Paolilla's story begins like so many others, a young girl struggling to find her place in the world. She was born in 1986 in Long Island, New York, and Christine had a challenging start in life. Her father passed away when she was only 2 years old, leaving her mother to raise her and her brother alone. Life didn't get easier from there either. Christine suffered from alopecia, a condition that caused her to lose her hair, her eyebrows, and her eyelashes at a young age. And in a world where appearance often determines how we get treated, Christine faced relentless bullying and rejection. Her self-esteem plummeted, and she became shy and withdrawn. But when she moved to Clear Lake, Texas, her life seemed to turn around. At Clear Lake High School, she made new friends, people who didn't judge her appearance, who made her feel accepted. Among them were Rachel Colorutis and Tiffany Rowell, 2 popular girls who took Christine under their wing. And in 2003, Christine's life seemed to be on an upward trajectory. Her classmates voted her Miss Irresistible, a title meant to reflect her resilience and newfound confidence. On the surface, it looked like she was thriving. But behind closed doors, Christine was dealing with personal demons, exacerbated by a toxic relationship with her boyfriend, Christopher Snyder. What could have led to the unimaginable, brutal murder of her own friends? Was Christine a victim of Christopher's influence, or was she an active participant in planning and carrying out the crime? And how does someone go from being the bullied underdog to the perpetrator of such a horrific act? This case leaves us with a troubling question. How much of our actions are shaped by those around us? All of us. And where do we draw the line between influence and personal accountability? On July 18th of 2003, the quiet suburban neighborhood of Clear Lake, Texas, was rocked by a quadruple homicide that left the community stunned. Rachel Colorutis and Tiffany Rowell, along with Tiffany's boyfriend, Marcus Priscilla, and their friend, Adelbert Sanchez, were found shot to death in Tiffany's home. The crime scene was horrific. Evidence suggested a violent struggle, and the victims shot multiple times at close range. At first, investigators struggled to piece together the events of that day. The victims were well-liked and had no apparent enemies. Drugs were found at the scene, leading authorities to believe the murders might have been drug-related. And for 3 years, this case went cold, with very few leads and no arrests. But now, in 2006, a tip comes in that breaks the case wide open. A friend of Christine's contacted the police, claiming Christine had confessed to the murders. According to the tipster, Christine had been struggling with guilt and substance abuse, haunted by what she and Christopher Snyder had done. Christine was arrested, and her once innocent facade crumbled as the details of the crime came to light. Investigators revealed that Christine and Christopher had entered Tiffany's home that day with the intention of stealing drugs and money. What started as a robbery quickly escalated into a massacre, leaving 4 people dead. The question remains, how does someone like Christine, who seemed to be turning her life around, become involved in such a horrific act? Was she manipulated by Christopher, or was she fully aware of her actions? And what role did their toxic relationship play in pushing them toward violence? As we continue, we'll explore the evidence and the events leading up to that fateful day, piecing together the puzzle of what truly happened inside that Clear Lake home. To understand the events of July 18th in 2003, we need to examine Christine's life leading up to that day. Despite her struggles with alopecia and bullying, Christine appeared to find stability and acceptance at Clear Lake High School. Her friendships with Rachel and Tiffany, 2 of the most popular girls in school, marked a turning point. They encouraged Christine to embrace her individuality, even helping her with wigs and makeup to help her boost her confidence. But after graduating in 2003, Christine's life began to unravel. She entered a relationship with Christopher Snyder, a young man with a troubled past. Described as controlling and manipulative, Christopher alienated Christine from her friends and family. The pair became increasingly isolated, relying on each other in a toxic cycle of dependence. Drugs became a central part of their relationship, further fueling their downward spiral. Now, on the day of the murders, Christine and Christopher allegedly planned to rob Tiffany's home, believing there was cash and drugs inside. Investigators later discovered that the 2 entered the house armed, but their motives went far beyond robbery. Witness accounts and forensic evidence painted a chilling picture. The couple shot all 4 victims multiple times, ensuring there were no witnesses. Christine and Christopher then fled the scene, leaving behind a chaotic crime scene that baffled investigators for years. With no immediate suspects, this case went cold. Friends and family of the victims were left in anguish, struggling to understand who could commit such a senseless act. It wasn't until Christine's arrest in 2006 that the details began to emerge. Her confession and the evidence against her shocked everyone who knew her. How could a girl who once seemed so innocent be capable of such brutality? As we move forward, we are going to dive deeper into the investigation and the trial, examining the evidence that ultimately led to Christine's conviction. Was justice served here, or do questions remain about what truly happened that day? Let's continue. In the years following the murders, Christine's life spiraled further out of control. After the horrific events at Tiffany's home, Christopher and Christine went on the run, severing ties with their friends and their family. Their relationship, already toxic, became a crutch as guilt and paranoia consumed them. Christine's struggle with substance abuse escalated, and the once promising high school graduate was now living in complete chaos. For 3 years, the Clear Lake murders remained unsolved. Investigators had little evidence to go on, apart from the gruesome scene and the scattered remnants of a botched robbery. Tips came in sporadically, but none of them led to a breakthrough, until a friend of Christine's came forward in 2006 with critical information. This friend revealed that Christine had confessed to the murders during a drug-fueled conversation, describing the crime in chilling detail. When police arrested Christine, they discovered she had been living in a motel, barely surviving as she battled drug addiction. Her arrest was a turning point in the case, finally giving investigators the lead they needed to tie her to the crime. Christopher Snyder, however, had evaded capture. Shortly after Christine's arrest, he was found dead by suicide, leaving many questions about his role in the murders unanswered. Christine's confession, coupled with forensic evidence and eyewitness accounts, painted a damning picture. Gunshot residue linked her to the weapon used in the murders, and her detailed account of the crime aligned with the evidence found at the scene. The trial that followed would reveal even more disturbing aspects of the case, including the calculated nature of the killings and the couple's twisted dynamic. As we transition to the trial here, I want you to consider this. Was Christine a broken woman, manipulated by a controlling boyfriend? Or was she an equal participant in the brutal murders of her friends? The evidence may provide some answers, but the ultimate truth remains elusive. The trial of Christine began in 2008, nearly 5 years after the Clear Lake murders. By this point, public interest in the case had surged. How could a young woman with no history of violence, described by many as a kind and sweet person, commit such a heinous crime? The courtroom became a stage where the dual narratives of Christine's life collided, her struggles with self-esteem and addiction, and the brutal reality of her actions. Prosecutors laid out a chilling sequence of events, arguing that Christine and Christopher planned the murders meticulously. They entered Tiffany's home under the pretense of a friendly visit, only to unleash a calculated and brutal attack. The prosecution emphasized Christine's role in luring the victims into a false sense of security, using her friendship with Tiffany and Rachel to gain access to the house. Christine's defense team, however, painted a different picture. They portrayed her as a deeply troubled young woman under the control of a manipulative and abusive boyfriend. According to the defense, Christopher orchestrated the crime, pressuring Christine into participating. And her addiction and fragile mental state, they argued, left her vulnerable to his influence. Key testimony came from witnesses who described Christine's behavior in the aftermath of the murders. Some said she seemed haunted. Others described her as indifferent. Surveillance footage, forensic evidence, and Christine's own statements to police were all presented to build a case against her. And ultimately, the jury was asked to decide, was Christine a cold-blooded killer or a victim of circumstances beyond her control? Well, in October of 2008, she was found guilty on 4 counts of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even with the verdict, questions lingered. Did the justice system fully understand the dynamics of her relationship with Christopher? And could the murders have been prevented if Christine had received help earlier in her life? These questions continue to fuel public debate, leaving this case far from closed in the court of public opinion. The trial of Christine was as much about the evidence as it was about the deeper questions of accountability and influence. And that's exactly why it's here in True Crime, the court of public opinion. Prosecutors framed her as a willing participant, a young woman who had become increasingly erratic and violent under the toxic dynamic of her relationship with Christopher Snyder. They pointed to the calculated nature of the crime, the planning, the execution, and the complete elimination of witnesses as proof that Christine knew exactly what she was doing. But the defense, they raised a haunting question. How do we judge someone whose mind and body were ravaged by drug addiction? Christine was deeply addicted to heroin at the time of the murders, a substance known to distort reality and cloud judgment. Defense attorneys argued that this wasn't the Christine her friends once knew, nor was it the Christine the world now saw standing trial. Her actions, they claimed, were the product of manipulation by Christopher Snyder and the powerful grip of addiction. Addiction, they argued, strips away choice. How can a person in such a state make rational decisions? More importantly, if her addiction fueled her behavior, should she be judged by the same standards as someone acting of their own free will? These questions cut to the heart of the case, and they left the jury grappling with Christine's culpability. When we, and this is important here, when we convict people who commit crimes under the influence of drug addiction, we must ask, where does the responsibility truly begin? Some argue that addiction clouds judgment and creates an alternate version of the person. You know, they always say they got addicted and they became someone I didn't recognize, right? We hear that. They become a mind and body that is now driven by the substance rather than reason. But at a deeper level, the choice to use heroin or any addictive drug, the first decision to use it, this decision carries with it a form of preemptive accountability. By choosing to use such a substance, a person knowingly opens the door to losing control and potentially committing acts they would never consider in their sober state. This can happen to anyone. Now, in that sense, the responsibility is not just for the crime itself. It's for the initial decision to use a drug that could warp their mind to such an extent. Christine's case forces us to ask, does the act of taking heroin already accept the possibility of violence and destruction or even murder? And if so, how does that shape how we judge and sentence someone who acted under its influence? This isn't just about the crime, it is about the moment someone chooses to step into a world where consequences are no longer their own to control. They've given that up by deciding to take a drug that takes that away from them. So again, where does the responsibility begin? Now, the prosecution, they leaned heavily on the premeditated nature of the Clear Lake murders to help cement Christine's guilt. So they argued that this was no impulsive act. Christine and Christopher Snyder brought weapons to the home, planned to rob their friends, and executed the murders with precision to leave no witnesses. Now, this has nothing to do with the drug addiction I talked about just a second ago. This is about simply the facts of the crime and what they did. And this is what the prosecution's bringing forward. And the evidence supported this narrative. The gunshot wounds were delivered at close range. Every victim was intentionally killed. The prosecutors painted Christine as a willing participant, fully aware of what was happening, and just as culpable as Christopher. The defense, however, they pushed back against this narrative, emphasizing Christine's fragile mental state and addiction as mitigating factors. So now we're seeing this addiction in a different way through the defense. Her attorneys argued that she was emotionally and psychologically manipulated by Christopher, a man they described as controlling and abusive. And they suggested that Christine's addiction to heroin didn't just cloud her judgment, it made her utterly dependent on Christopher, willing to follow his lead to keep their toxic bond intact. So this raised a critical question for the jury. How much of Christine's involvement was driven by her own agency? How much was a product of her circumstances? The defense reminded the court of Christine's history and her struggles with alopecia, the bullying, her desire to belong. And they argued that these factors made her especially vulnerable to someone like Christopher, who preyed on her insecurities and drove her deeper into addiction. But the prosecution countered with a chilling point. While addiction and manipulation might explain Christine's actions, they certainly don't excuse them. They reminded the jury that Christine actively participated in these murders. She did not try to stop Christopher or call for help afterward. Instead, she fled the scene and remained silent for years, even as the families of the victims sought justice. Ultimately, the jury faced a difficult decision: if Christine was a victim of her circumstances, or was she just as responsible as Christopher for the horrific events that unfolded in Clear Lake. The tension between these arguments left the courtroom divided. A lot to think about here. It all reflected the same public debate that still continues, by the way, on this case to this day. Now, beyond the immediate facts of the case, the defense also raised philosophical and societal questions. Should we consider the broader implications of punishing someone who acted under the influence of both a toxic relationship and a debilitating addiction? Christine's attorneys argued that society often overlooks how addiction fundamentally changes the brain. And they pointed out that Christine's heroin use, it didn't just impair her judgment, it rewired her sense of reality. Because that is what drugs like this do. And in their view, the Christine who walked into Tiffany's home that day was not the same person standing trial years later. But the prosecution, they refused to let addiction become an excuse. They argued that while addiction might explain Christine's actions, it did not absolve her of responsibility. Her decision to use heroin was her choice, and that choice set the stage for everything that followed. Everything. To allow addiction to mitigate her culpability, they contended, would set a dangerous precedent that, hey, crimes committed under the influence are somehow less deserving of punishment, so, hey, just go ahead and get yourself under the influence and you can just do whatever you want. This point sparked heated debate in both the courtroom and in public opinion, as you can imagine. Addiction is a difficult thing to discuss. Is it fair to judge someone who acted while under the grip of addiction by the same standards as a sober individual acting with a clear mind? Or does acknowledging addiction as a mitigating factor risk creating a loophole for accountability? It's a very tricky thing. And how it plays out in a court of law, which is very black and white, is even more difficult. Adding another layer even to this argument was the testimony of those who knew Christine before and after these murders. Friends from high school described her as a kind and shy person, eager to please, a far cry from the person who committed such a brutal act. This transformation, they argued, highlighted the destructive power of addiction and the influence of Christopher Snyder. But the prosecution highlighted Christine's actions after the murders, her years of complete silence, her attempts to evade capture, her refusal to come forward as evidence mounted. These were also choices, and they argued they reflected a level of awareness and guilt that contradicted the defense's portrayal of her as a helpless victim. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, one thing became clear. Christine's story wasn't just about one crime. This was about the intersection of personal choice, societal responsibility, and the devastating consequences of addiction. Okay, so why is this case still being debated now, in today? Not because of what happened, that's for sure. It's because of the larger questions it forces us to confront. At the heart of the controversy is that blurred line between victim and perpetrator that we talk about a lot here in True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Was Christine a young woman manipulated by a controlling boyfriend and ravaged by addiction? Or was she a calculating killer who used those factors as a shield for her actions? One of the most contentious points here is how addiction plays into justice. Some argue that addiction, while devastating, cannot and should not excuse criminal behavior. They believe Christine's actions should be judged based on their outcomes, not her state of mind at the time. Others, however, point to the broader societal failures that allowed Christine to spiral into addiction in the first place. If she had received the help she needed, could these murders have been prevented? And if society failed her, does that failure diminish her culpability? The media's portrayal of Christine further fueled the controversy. On one hand, she was depicted as a Miss Irresistible, a young woman who overcame bullying and personal struggles to win her peers' admiration. On the other hand, headlines pointed her as a heartless killer, coldly betraying friends who had supported her. This duality, the innocent facade versus the brutal crime, it captivated the public and left many struggling to reconcile the two. Adding to the debate is Christopher Snyder's role in the crime. With his suicide, he took many answers to the grave, leaving Christine to bear the full weight of the public scrutiny. How much of what happened was his influence versus her own agency? And without his testimony, can we ever fully understand the dynamics of their relationship and their shared culpability? Ultimately, the controversy surrounding Christine isn't just about her guilt or innocence. It's about the broader questions her case raises about addiction, manipulation, and the way society handles those who fall through the cracks. These unanswered questions continue to fuel debate, keeping the Clear Lake murders alive in the court of public opinion. And then another layer of controversy here lies the concept of rehabilitation versus retribution. As Christine serves her life sentence, some argue that incarceration in its current form fails to address the root causes of her actions. And for many, the question isn't just whether Christine deserves to be punished, but whether the system offers any path for someone like her, a person who acted under the influence of addiction and manipulation, to truly reform. Critics of the criminal justice system point out that addiction is often treated as a moral failing rather than a medical condition. Christine's case highlights this tension. If addiction fundamentally altered her capacity to make rational choices, what does punishment really achieve here? Does it serve as a deterrent? Or is it simply a way to satisfy society's desire for retribution? And what happens to someone like Christine when they're forced to confront their actions in a sober state? Because obviously she goes to prison, she's going to get sober again. And years removed from the haze of drugs and chaos later, what does she think then? Public opinion on this issue is starkly divided. Some view Christine's sentence as just, believing that her actions, no matter the circumstances, warrant the harshest punishment. Others see her as a tragic figure, a woman who, given the right support, might have had a very different life. This debate is particularly resonant in the context of addiction, which continues to be one of society's most misunderstood and stigmatized issues. And the role of the media, of course, cannot be ignored, never can. Her story was sensationalized, her appearance and past struggles often used to craft a narrative that oscillated between sympathy and condemnation. This media-driven dichotomy raises other questions. How much of our perception of guilt and innocence is shaped not by facts, but the way the story is told? Ultimately, Christine's case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, as these cases do. Not just about her actions, but about the systems and societal forces that failed her and her victims. In the court of public opinion, her guilt may be clear, but the broader implications of her case remain murky, leaving us to grapple with the complexities of justice, accountability, and redemption. And as Christine sits there in prison, there's another unsettling question. What does she regret more? Being caught for the murders? Doing the murders? or the decision to ever start using heroin? This question speaks to the core of her story, where addiction and accountability collide in ways that are impossible to untangle. Her addiction was the catalyst for so much of what went wrong in her life. It fueled her toxic relationship with Christopher. It clouded her judgment. And it ultimately pushed her to commit an unthinkable act she can never take back. In the years since her conviction, she's faced life in prison, and it's hard not to wonder if sobriety has brought clarity. Does she now see her addiction as the starting point for everything that followed? Or is her regret more focused on the consequences of being caught and losing her freedom and the irreversible impact of her choices? These questions add another dimension to this case. For many, the line between personal accountability and the influence of addiction is clear. Once she chose to use heroin, the question is more complicated. Because addiction is a disease, some say. Some say it isn't. Its grip can be stronger than any moral compass. Some don't think it can do that. How do we judge someone who may have lost their ability to choose long before the crime was even conceived? Christine's story forces us to confront these moral and philosophical dilemmas. If she had not started using heroin, would she have still ended up in that house with a gun in her hand? Or was her path to destruction laid long before, through the toxic dynamics of her relationship with Christopher and the unresolved trauma of her past? These are the haunting questions that keep the Clear Lake murders alive in the public consciousness. As we reflect, what do we regret when everything falls apart around us? The actions we took, or the choices that led us to a place where those actions became possible? And with a drug like heroin, could we even say that if you make a choice like Christine to start using something like heroin, are bad things in your future inevitable? And so we come to the end of this tragic and deeply complex story. Christine's case leaves us with more questions than answers. We have to grapple with the nature of guilt and influence and addiction. And at its heart lies a woman whose life spiraled out of control through her choices, her relationships, and the overpowering grip of heroin. But now the decision lies with you. Was Christine a victim of circumstances, a vulnerable young woman manipulated by addiction and an abusive partner? Or was she an active participant in the cold and calculated murders of 4 innocent people? Should her addiction mitigate her accountability? Or does her choice to use heroin in the first place make her fully responsible for what followed? And finally, as Christine serves her life sentence, what do you believe weighs heaviest on her mind? Does she regret the brutal murders she committed, the lives she destroyed, and the pain she caused? Or does she look back with regret at the moment she first chose to use heroin, knowing that one choice set her on a path to irreversible tragedy? These are the questions that linger not just in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. That's us. And now it's your turn to decide. Was justice truly served? Or is this story far more complicated than any verdict could ever capture? Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most unsettling cases we've covered. Christine's story is a stark reminder of how addiction, relationships, and personal choices can collide with devastating consequences. The Clear Lake murders remain a haunting example of how lives can unravel and how justice, no matter how decisive, can still leave us grappling with unanswered questions. As always, the court has made its ruling, but the case continues in the court of public opinion. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Was Christine a victim? Or was she fully responsible for the choices she made? We can keep the conversation going because the real story often lies in the questions we ask, not just in the answers we find. Thank you for joining me in True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Stay safe out there, stay curious, and ask the difficult questions. And until next time, this is Alexis Knight.